Good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here. I'm replacing my friend Daniel Marques. I'm Daniel Becker. I'm a lawyer focused on technology. And I'm here with Stefan, who will talk about regulation on AI. And here with me, we will speak about the geopolitics of AI, including the US and China debate. And afterwards, I will speak a little bit about how Brazil is starting to regulate artificial intelligence. So if you have any questions after the panel, we will be glad to answer them, or at least try to answer them, because a lot of things that we will talk about here doesn't have answer already. So please, Ming, go ahead. It's your time.
Can you hear me? Okay. Boa tarde. Good afternoon. My Portuguese is really limited, and português é muito difícil. So I'm going to speak in English, and I hope you will bear with me. My name is Min Jan. I'm an associate professor of communication studies from UNC Charlotte, United States. Since May, I've been spending some time here at FGV Law School as a CyberBRICS China fellow. I'm grateful for Ivar and Luca right there taking the picture to invite me to join the conference today. Also being part of this panel that includes experts from Brazil and Germany. So thank you also for the opportunity to exchange ideas with you all this afternoon. My research background is in Chinese internet politics. So I wrote quite a bit about Chinese search engine algorithms back 5-6 years ago when that was a hot topic. And we know that in the past few years, the evolution of technology recently has included a lot more interesting and challenging topics, including social media, big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and more. In preparation for today's talk, I initially thought I would talk about something uniquely Chinese called the social credit system. We can talk about it during the Q&A if you want, but given the panel's theme on artificial intelligence and algorithm, I'll focus on that particular topic. For the talk today, I will focus on two things. In the first part, I will talk about what is AI and its applications and potential problems that it creates for human beings. And second, I will focus on the geopolitics of AI, particularly the competition between China, US, and EU, and how their development strategies may impact AI development globally, but also perhaps implications for Brazil as well. So to clarify, when I talk about AI, artificial intelligence, I'm not talking about things like the Terminator, or R2-D2 from Star Wars, or most recently an excellent film I would recommend called Ex Machina. These utopian or dystopian imaginings of our future are perhaps a little too far out to become reality one day. By AI, I'm also not referring to sort of the long philosophical debate about what constitutes intelligence and how artificial intelligence can be realized technically. I'm here talking about AI in a more practical sense. I'm using the term to refer to the ability of machines or computers to classify information, recognize patterns, perform tasks, predict outcomes, and inform decision-making. So it's practical, very sort of, definition and low-level definition for artificial intelligence. For example, robots can be programmed to recognize colors between red, yellow, and green. Robots can also be programmed and designed to stop in front of an object, right? It doesn't really sound too miraculous. I think a lot of people understand in the past few years, there's a lot of progress in artificial intelligence. But if you combine those capacities with the GPS, then you have the building blocks of, simply self-driving car, right? So besides self-driving cars, in the area of transportation, drones have been applied in many areas. Amazon, for example, uses drones to deliver goods, but drones can also be programmed and used to fertilize crops, take area photos, I think many people enjoy doing, survey an area and guard an area, even shoot missiles and wage wars. So like the internet, I argue that drones and many AI applications are multi-use and multi-purpose technologies that can potentially create a lot of problems for regulation. So while you may not, sort of need a license to use drones as toys, for example, for consumers, but for commercial and military use, different rules may have to apply. AI has also made a lot of inroads in retail with potentially catastrophic economic and social consequences. In retail, for instance, Amazon warehouses, you don't see wall-to-wall people. You see wall-to-wall robots, right? And they're working 24/7, nonstop. They have been programmed even to recharge themselves at a charging station, right, to get power and continue working. So on the consumer end, Amazon now is opening quite a few stores in 3 cities in America where grocery shoppers can go into the store, grab what they want, and check out without waiting in line because checkout is automatic, right? So as you can tell from both the front end or the back end, Amazon is eliminating a lot of jobs and workers, right? It's estimated that in the next 3 to 4 years, Amazon is likely to eliminate 30% of all American malls and stores. That also means a lot of jobs will be lost, right? And in America, the top 5 jobs are administrative work, including call centers, retail and sales, fast food preparation, trucking and transportation, and manufacturing. So this kind of large-scale displacement of human beings and workers require really systematic and proactive public policies to avoid widening wealth gap and social disruption. And I can tell you China is doing the same thing. And considering China is a huge manufacturer, the world's factory, it is a very, I think, serious source of concern for the government there. So, but it's not only just the repetitive jobs that will be automated away. Some high-skill jobs are also vulnerable. For instance, you can think about risk assessment in insurance companies. They're increasingly using big data to do that work that used to be done by human beings. In financial sector, loan applications these days are increasingly being approved using this similar approach. Even high-frequency trading, right? Traders are also worried about their own jobs being taken by robots. In medicine, for instance, there are increasing a lot of applications of AI. Let me show you this too. Oh, sorry. Can you phrase that for a second? I don't want to be a distraction, but you can tell a lot of robots have been programmed to do a lot more these days. In addition to the impact on jobs, I think a third kind of issue that needs to be dealt with definitely is AI ethics. There's a lot of discussion in this area. Ethical issues involving accountability, transparency, due process, equity, privacy, and so on. So we can imagine a situation where medical AI can probably make a mistake in diagnosis. So whose responsibility would it be? Do you blame the manufacturer of the system? Do you blame the programmer who programmed the AI? Or do you blame the doctor, right? And so increasingly, I think AI is going to create a lot of not only ethical issues, but also regulatory issues. So how do we approach AI? How can we govern AI to make it work for human beings, for us? So for too long, the public discourse has been dominated by a form of what I call technocentrism or instrumental solutionism that frames technology as a solution to every human problem. And every human problem can somehow be sliced and diced if we have enough data, right? And that is a really big problem. If you think about it, we often talk about, the fact that there's sort of quote unquote an app for everything, right? As if that's the only way to solve human problems. The question now is, what if technology itself is the problem? Okay. So a lot of work needs to be done in the space of AI ethics to make sure AI does align with our fundamental human values. But also, radical times also probably require innovative social policies. Should we react to AI revolution the same way Luddites in the 19th century react to weaving machine, right? And back in the 19th century, British and English weavers actually tried to destroy these weaving machinery as a form of protest. So one could look back to history and say, well, that was pretty silly. After all, after hundreds of years, things have worked out for human beings, and why should we worry? But for the millions of people who are losing their jobs and about to lose their jobs, this is actually an existential human rights question. And further, one possible solution that has been proposed actually on the table now in the US is the idea of robot tax. Think about how robots can work for us and how they can be taxed to help us survive this age of AI. In fact, a US presidential candidate running for the 2020 election now is proposing a universal basic income, $1,000 per month for every adult American, to sort of, cushion the transition into a new age of AI revolution. A large portion of this funding actually comes from the so-called robot tax. U.S. tech firms, for example, Amazon, they don't pay a dime in federal tax. And that is highly problematic for a lot of U.S. citizens. So perhaps it's a time to consider how robots can help human beings as well. For the second part of my talk, I want to shift gears a little bit to consider the geopolitics of AI by talking about by taking a political economy approach to compare U.S., China, EU in their AI development. Lately, I don't know if you feel the same way, the political economy of internet studies is making a comeback, and I think rightly so. For a long time, we've treated the internet as a medium on which people socialize, transact, trade, and mobilize, instead of treating it as a byproduct of a new stage of capitalism. Where essentially a handful of very big internet giants, mostly from US and China, are using it to deploy their products and services with amazing profits and based on endless extraction of user data. On the US side, we have Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Twitter. On the Chinese side, we have companies like Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu. How many of you are familiar with these companies, especially the Chinese ones? Okay, great. So this is a very tech sophisticated audience for sure. So AI is no different. I mean, that's my argument, because the leading players in this space, AI space, are still these same companies, right? So how they will compete against each other will, to a large extent, tell the story of AI development in the future. So instead of talking about AI in the abstract sense, I think it's also perhaps useful to discuss how industrial players, state policies, and international financial capital co-produce AI technologies and products in the current geopolitical and trade environment. So between 2017 and 2018, almost every advanced industrial nation has issued some sort of AI strategy. But the AI field is really dominated by, essentially two players from US and China, with EU emerging as a really important regulatory authority, especially through GDPR. So let me focus on the sort of interplay between them. In terms of the US perspective on AI governance, let me share with you one specific example. This is a model called Layered Model of AI Governance, proposed by Harvard researcher Gasser and colleagues, right? So you can tell they structured the model into three layers. At the bottom of the layer, it says in the near term, the layer should focus on technical questions, data, and algorithm. In the medium term, they argue that we should focus on ethical questions. And in the long term, they argue that we should look at social and legal instruments. So this sounds, I think, somewhat logical, but I also argue is highly problematic. So first, if you think about this particular model proposed here, it's particularly, I think, uniquely US-centric, reflecting the fundamental problems that we see America regulating AI and technology industry in general. Currently, we know that the US government society really doesn't have any sound data protection plan. In many ways, the U.S. Tech industry is the biggest beneficiary of this sort of hands-off policy, right? And it's the biggest beneficiary of surveillance capitalism, even though doing so will come at the cost of users worldwide. So for many geopolitical reasons, I think U.S. government is very reluctant to regulate its tech industry. Elsewhere, we know EU in 2018, last year, passed a really interesting data protection plan to protect personal data and privacy, GDPR. So I think we're seeing new models of governance for sure. I think, you can talk about, the problems of the internet, and you talk about the problems that we might face with the AI indefinitely. But it's quite I think there's quite difference between how you talk about it and then what you do about it. And I think EU has had enough with this and just said, well, heck, let's start doing something about this, and let's start regulate. I think in many ways, GDPR maybe is not a perfect solution right now, but it has many really good aspects, and it has, I think, it's a really good start, and it can be perfected, maybe improved over time. And I think to some extent, the sort of sheer focus to talk about AI ethics, especially proposed by Google, for example, Google has its own AI ethic code, is almost a distraction, a strategy to avoid actually legal actions that can do something to these tech industries. So I think there's a fine balance between how you talk about AI ethics in the abstract versus having legal sanctions to actually do something to regulate the field. And second, I think America's reluctance to do anything is also deeply embedded. It's in this particular neoliberal logic, right, that treats the market as something sacred and treats the market as something untouchable. According to sort of the free market economics, right, the invisible hand is supposed to regulate the market and make it efficient and distribute resources fairly. But, I think after what happened in the 2008 financial crisis and recently the Cambridge Analytica scandal, people start to ask questions. So where was the invisible hand when it's supposed to work, right? And so I think a lot of people are waking up to this reality. If we don't do anything about it, then the situation is not going to improve. So there's a lot of, I think, also that's why I think in the US, if you talk about taxation, although this is an idea I think accepted in a lot of European countries, but in the United States, the idea of taxation is almost sort of an inherently evil instrument by the government, that should be avoided at all cost. So there are different mentalities when it comes to social policies. So on the EU front, I think they're doing something quite interesting. EU now is drawing a lot of its AI policies based on GDPR, the data policy. EU also tries to create a European AI alliance, right, to compete against China and the US. It also promises to make investments in both in research talents and financial investments. So I think EU is trying to do quite a lot. But there are also four fundamental problems that I see in the EU AI strategy. First, it really doesn't have companies at the scale to compete against the companies that we see in the United States or China. And second, European countries, from what I could see, seems to be struggle with nurturing a culture of innovation. Third, it does support it does, try to produce top-level scientists, especially in computer science. But when they do, these talents are lured away very quickly by U.S. and Chinese companies. And fourth, the last one, I think, from what I could see, there isn't really a lot of EU coordination at the highest level between the industry, the EU Commission, and European capital. Let me give an example. Recently, the French transportation company called Bolero actually struck a deal, right, with Alibaba, Chinese company, right, through Alibaba Cloud Services. So all these EU companies, they are free to do what they want, right? But when you have that kind of, separate strategies, you really don't have enough bargaining power at the table. China, on the other hand, is doing quite a bit. Its model is is sort of centralized and coordinated at the very top level, and is state-driven. You can talk about, how China sort of regulated foreign business out of the country, but you also have to admit that the China model is the only one that can answer to Silicon Valley, right, at the time. So in the past 20 years, we know that China has developed its own nationalistic strategy in a way to achieve a great degree of self-dependence. So EU had its plan in 2017 and 2018, but I think China has been doing this for quite a while and doing it quite well at the sort of state policy level. In 2015, for example, China has the initiative called Made in China 2025, focusing on smart manufacturing. 2016, it also passed a very important initiative for upgrading traditional industries inside China. Also in the same year, China passed its 13th five-year plan for national science and tech innovation. And further, 2016, there are lots of strategies and policy investments to focus on emerging industries. So these are policy coordination that we really don't see from the EU level, right? In sort of the US model, they're sort of free to do whatever they want, but we are seeing a different development strategy and plan from China. But I also must admit that China's AI, artificial intelligence, will remain Chinese. What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. I know it's Chinese, I'll explain this to you. Okay, so in 2017, 2 years ago, Tencent, the top Chinese internet company, created a chatbot, right, called Little Eyes, okay? It went rogue. So when asked by people, do you love the Communist Party? Guess what the answer is? Exactly, no. And when asked, what's your Chinese dream? Guess what the answer is? It's right there, actually. Except you can't read it. It actually says, my Chinese dream is to move to America. Guess what happens to this chatbot? Of course, states shut it down immediately, right? So that's what I meant. Chinese AI will remain Chinese in that sense. So I think it's quite naive for a lot of people, at least from a Western perspective, hoping Chinese internet or Chinese AI will somehow be ideologically different. And I think that's a misconception that we've had for a long time. And the past 25 years have told quite a different story about the Chinese internet. And I don't think the AI from China will be somewhat different. So that creates problems, I think, to a lot of extent when we talk about the geopolitics of AI in the future. So let me wrap up by saying that another point I want to make is that a lot of people focus, when they talk about AI, they focus on sort of the competition between different companies. And the point for me to talk about sort of China's AI strategy from the government perspective is to emphasize that the government, the state, still has a role to play. This is a very different strategy compared to U.S. American development model, right, where the companies have played a big role, but we are seeing something, I think, from China where Chinese government is making bets on these important initiatives that requires a lot of funding, right, requires a lot of initial startup funding, and that cannot be done by industry alone. To go back to the EU example, EU actually came up with a plan, AI plan, that proposes 20 billion EU euros for that. And among the 20 billion, only 2 billion are actually public funding. The 18 billion euros are supposed to come from private industries. I'm not sure how that will work out, I mean, to be honest, at the practical level, right? And so there are different strategies of how this might work out. So the final point that I want raise is that, you know, we can talk about the sort of competition between the three, US, EU, and China, but there are also some interesting, I think, currents and developments. For example, a lot of you probably know this company called SoftBank, right? It's a Japanese company making a lot of investments in technology and in finance, basically. It has, on its own, $100 billion called SoftBank Vision Fund, right? That goes around the world to buy up and invest in really interesting, promising technology firms, including AI. So, you know, when you look at SoftBank, it's really not clear which states it represents, because the largest states investors in SoftBank are sovereign wealth funds from Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, right? So EU company also played a role, and Daimler, which is a EU company, is also an investor. So increasingly, I think there are also more and more global players in the mix as well. So I think to some extent, the picture I'm trying to paint here is, you know, an AI arms race is almost underway. It's not only valuable to talk about artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence AI ethics, but also I think there's sort of needs to be a geopolitical discussion about AI that will shape the future development of AI in the next decade. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. It's your time, Stefan.
Okay, my time. Thank you so much. Thank you, Min, for the first words. My name is Stefan Brink. I'm the State Commissioner for Data Protection and Freedom of Information in the southern part of Germany, and I'm going to talk about the regulation of artificial intelligence and the ethics of these regulations. As Min just pointed out, artificial intelligence has found its way into our everyday life. And I begin with two examples just to illustrate how far we got. First of all, your navigation system decides for you which street to take to get faster to your destination, and I assume nobody has a problem with it. This is an obvious case where decision making from algorithms is broadly accepted. But to what extent would we be willing to give a machine the power to decide for you? What if the machine decides over you? And do we even realize this? Last week, the New York Times reported about a quite interesting federal lawsuit of Tulsi Gabbard. Don't you know if you know her? She is a candidate from Hawaii, I think, a candidate who's running for the US presidency. And she has a lawsuit versus Google. The algorithm of Google noticed an unusual increase of search requests and briefly suspended her campaign's advertising account. This decision making was based on an AI with huge impact, leading to the effect that nobody could Google the presidential candidate from Hawaii for a certain period. In this case, everybody confirms that the decision making from the Google algorithm interfered in an individual's liberties and decisions. Therefore, legislators and supervisory authorities like mine have to develop a framework for the use of artificial intelligence and just to protect fundamental human rights. Only if the protection of fundamental rights and data protection can keep pace with the process of digitalization, a future is possible in which, in the end, human beings and not machines decide. This does, of course, not mean that AI systems are completely bad or have to be banned. On the contrary, as long as we monitor and regulate the development and usage of AI systems, artificial intelligence will help to handle problems independently and maybe even free from human prejudices. In April 2019, this year, federal and state data protection supervisory authorities of Germany have outlined 7 data protection requirements for AI systems. And I'm going to talk to you about some of these ideas for regulating. The first idea is called AI must not turn human beings into objects. It's part of a guarantee of human dignity of our constitution, and it demands that an individual must not be objectified, particularly not in the case that AI is being used by public authorities. But in my opinion, it's almost the same idea when you talk about private authorities using artificial intelligence. I'm sure that nobody would accept the decision, for example, of an AI judge in a criminal proceeding stating how long an accused has to go to jail. Nevertheless, an AI system giving the judge suggestions for the duration of imprisonment may be accepted as long as it's the judge who is finally deciding. The big uncertainty lies in between. To what extent do we accept this, and can we still monitor it? The problem isn't always the machine, but the human being itself. We tend to give up not only our thinking, but our decision making. It is an upcoming trend that we accept that machines decide for us, most of the time out of sheer laziness. We are just too busy to decide ourselves. We have better things or more interesting things to do, and so we let the machine go. Let's get back to our example on navigation systems. It is so much easier to simply follow the instructions of our GPS, even for well-known routes, than to think about alternatives. So the risk that AI can turn human beings into objects is often self-created. Second idea about regulating AI. AI must be, that's not mine, that's another idea of the state commissioners concerning the limitation of purpose when using private data, but that is rather a formal point, so we'll move on to this one. AI must be transparent, comprehensible, and explainable. Decisions taken on the basis of AI systems must be, as I said, comprehensible and explainable. Only if we have a deeper insight on the procedures of processing and, to a certain extent, on the used training data, we can understand and control the AI system and the decision-making itself. This was a big issue for the so-called YouTube algorithm, an algorithm deciding whether a video gets monetized or not. YouTube didn't want to reveal how this system decides to prevent exploitations and manipulations, but the risk behind is that YouTube influences our opinion forming by demonetizing, for example, videos on certain political issues, and thus making it unattractive for YouTubers to place such content in videos. To control the algorithm, we need to understand how the system decides, otherwise we aren't capable to realize that we tend to let us manipulate by the AI system. Next idea, AI must avoid discrimination. Learning systems are highly dependent on the data entered. An AI system of a company was used to evaluate job application documents with the goal of deciding free from human prejudices. Fine idea, great idea. However, the company had hired predominantly male applicants in the past, and the AI system had been trained with their successful applications. As a result, the AI system assessed women as being much less qualified, although the gender criterion was not explicitly predetermined. This shows that the evaluation of a so-called neutral system was even more discriminating than a human decision making, all because the training data was delusive and misleading. The definitely desirable wish of the company to decide free from human prejudices couldn't be eliminated, but rather has been increased. Next idea. I skipped that too. That's about the principle of minimization. Extremely interesting because we are thinking about reducing the amount of data that is processed. A really hard job for those who try to find training data for artificial intelligence systems. Next idea I'm going to discuss. Artificial intelligence needs responsibility. There must be a controller behind the scene who's responsible and takes the measures in order to achieve lawful processing. Not only the developer of AI has to grant the principle of privacy by design, but also it's one of the big and perhaps famous principles of GDPR. It's not only the developer, but also the organization buying and using the AI system has to satisfy the requirements of data protection. Companies purchasing and using IT solutions based on AI technologies are controllers and therefore have to prevent manipulations by third parties which can affect the results of the system. They have, as a controller, to carry out a risk assessment and, if required, carry out a data protection impact assessment according to the GDPR when they start using the system, and as well as when it is in use. The use of an AI-based system cannot lead to the conclusion that nobody is responsible for the results it takes. Quite in contrary, using AI system means that you have to ensure you're using a good system for protecting the rights of data subject, such as the right to information, to access, or the right to deletion. To sum it up, we can compare the use of algorithms. There's one more thing I wanted to show you. To sum it up, we can compare the use of algorithms and artificial intelligence with a complex system of democracy. We do need a good set of checks and balances to limit artificial decision making whenever it is necessary, but to truly give a chance for AI as a self-learning system which may enable humans to make more effective choices and improved decisions. As long as the human stays the core decision maker, AI may help humans providing adequate competence and information for a decision in question, as long as the AI system remains rather assisting than determining. But as long as the human stays behind the system, AI will never compensate human imperfection. That's the next paradox of this whole problematic. This is a conflict we need to solve in the future whenever we want to use artificial intelligence. Thank you.
Before we open the panel for questions, I would like to make some short remarks. Try to complement a little bit what have been said here. Can I use it? Thank you. So, just going back a little bit to talk about machine learning, and the main issue here, especially the decisions that affect most of us, they work basically on data, which is inputted on the artificial intelligence application, and it's basically uses pattern recognition to understand a model and to predict, automatizing what has been, what is happening in the data, what has happened before. So this is a model for two sorts of supervised learning, machine learning, and unsupervised machine learning. The first one can be exemplified, a very important example, and which I'll talk about and has been said here, which is the credit score. Also, insurance companies also do prepare a score to evaluate whether someone should pay for insurance, or if it will be refused the insurance. And this is a good example of supervised learning. And the another example, unsupervised learning, I think this one is the best example, because without parameters, probably a machine will understand that they are grouped in this sort because they don't understand which is Looney Tunes or Disney, for instance, and because you see two like a rabbit and a rat, and then three ducks, and they aggregate them themselves. And I don't know if you heard of this case. It's very important for what we were talking about because this case happened with a mega store in the U.S., Target, for those who don't know it, and with high-profile data scientists using machine learning, Target could predict some behavior of its consumers, and in a situation which is kind of funny. I don't know if you heard of the story. There was a father who came with his daughter to Target complaining that you're disrespecting my daughter. You sent her a gift for like 10% of discount, congratulating her for her baby, and she's a minor. And then he came back and phoned Target and said, "Oh, it happens that Target knows what is happening in my house better than me because my daughter is actually pregnant." And it's a very interesting, funny story, but also makes us really worried when we think that we are using machine learning, artificial intelligence to predictive policing. So at least in the US and some parts of England as well, the policy is using machine learning to predict whether the crime will happen. It seems like some dystopic. Everybody remembers the movie with Tom Cruise, Minority Report, which they could predict like in almost real time when a crime would happen. But the complaint which is happening right now, it's because it's increasing the abuse of police officers against minorities, and it's a very important issue because I love this example of what is happening right now in artificial intelligence, at least the general applications that we face. This is a movie. I don't know if you've seen this movie. It's called Starman. In Portuguese, Starman, Homem das Estrelas. A very common, very famous movie in the 80s. And this guy in the right, he's an alien, and he came to Earth and he becomes friends with this girl. And he said, I learned to drive. And okay, so then he almost crashed the vehicle. And she said, oh, come on, you said you learned to drive. And he said, yeah, I learned to drive watching other people drive. So green, you speed up. In green light, you speed up. In red light, you stop. In yellow light, you speed up even more. So that's what really happened with society. And it's a very good example. Also, we have a problem, as Stefan brought up, that we have Compass, which is one of the softwares that the U.S. criminal justice system uses to profile the criminals to decide whether they reoffend. And after a lawyer tried to audit the algorithm of Compass, it was refused by the Supreme Court of Wisconsin because it understood that if the algorithm was just helping the judge to render his decision, it would be okay in some instance. And then the lawyer filed an appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States, but the appeal was dismissed because in the U.S. the Supreme Court justice, they can choose which appeals they will judge. Different in Brazil as well, but here we pretend they don't, but actually it's the same. And in the end, what happened, a lot of people got really concerned because it became public. New York Times published an article on it, and NGO called ProPublica started to study the outcome of this application and discovered that it was biased against Afro-Americans. And then a lot of people started talking about regulating, especially these algorithms used by the state. And it was not the only example, the criminal justice, but also the predictive policing, an employment algorithm that was being used by the New York City, and also which was at some instance biased against minorities or things like that. But on the other hand, there are some cases which make us think which one is better. Should we allow that machines take the decisions for us, make the random decision, or the humans are better at it. In this case, this is a very famous case. The guy on the left killed, he was a member of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, and he killed the guy on the right. And he was, I forgot the name. He was found not guilty by the jurors, a whole white jurors. And afterwards, like 20 years ago or 30 years later, he was found guilty. So in this case, we can see like a very clear bias of the humans, which could be solved at some instance by the machine. And I don't know if you heard of it. I bet that the majority of you are lawyers. I'm not sure. How many are lawyers here? No, I was making. I'm sorry, but then there's a very famous study in Israel about judges' behaviors and judges' biases. The study, the research was very criticized, but lawyers, you understand that it was totally accurate. It understood that judges, just before the lunch, used to render the hardest decisions. You mean like the worst penalties, then after the breakfast or just after lunch. So then, when the judges are hungry, they tend to be toughest when they are rendering their decisions. So it's another thing that we should think. Everybody that works with litigation, works with courts, with lawsuits, knows that the bias of the judge is very decisive, is very important for the decision in the end, and how machines somehow can help us. And bringing up GDPR, Stefan could speak much better than me. I would like to make a parallel because I don't know if you know, but GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation from the European Union, inspired our General Data Protection Law. And there's a very interesting aspect of the GDPR because GDPR regulates, actually the directive from the 90s also regulated it, and then GDPR brought it again. But in the Brazilian legislation, the first regulation was a precedent by the Superior Court of Justice, which decided that when you are profiled by a financial institution, you have the right to understand the criteria that was used in that decision. And then our legislation brings up it again and expands its uses for their uses for another industries such as insurance. Every decision that impacts somehow the life of someone or his legal sphere, his rights and stuff like that. So it's very hard to apply this legislation because all the time, as was clear here in this panel, we are being profiled, decisions are being made about us, and whether we can enforce it, whether it's easy, which efforts we need to use reverse engineering to understand this process. It is not a trivial task. It's not easy to do that, and I know that I worked with a lawyer in Germany, in Frankfurt, for some time during the GDPR to help Brazilian companies to adapt to the legislation because it has extraterritorial effects. And after the GDPR, a lot of people were sending cease and desist letters in Germany. And my point is that we know that Brazil, we have 80 million lawsuits and growing, and we are a litigious society. And the GDP, our Brazilian data protection legislation is opening a lot of doors. I was talking with Bernardo, my friend, about this. And also, is the general data protection, the Brazilian data protection law is going to foster innovation or kill innovation? Because if you think how the approach, being a very legislation with a lot of principles and not any specific regulation or technical regulation, we can open the door and allow that judges decide whether the legislation will be applied. And it makes me really worried about how this legislation will be interpreted by the judges, by the public prosecutor office, by public defenders, and the other institutions. And also, our data protection authority has not been formed yet. It is not autonomous. It's linked to the presidency, and it will be entitled to to look at the whole market, since the big tech companies and the bar in the corner. So it has a very huge attribution, and we are a country that doesn't have this data protection tradition. It's very new for us, and it's funny because I was talking about a friend that she used it to work at Google, and she said Brazilians don't like privacy or data protection. Who likes privacy and data protection are lawyers. And it's funny because she was telling me that when she received a lot of messages when she was working at Google. You should please tell the car from Google Street View to go in my street on Sunday because I'll make a barbecue there. And I painted my house. Go please. So Brazilians like it. So it's very funny. And also, she was telling me that once when she was at Google, she was at the Silicon Valley and was with a Polish lawyer from Google in Poland. And this friend, her colleague, said it was looking at the highway in the U.S. and said that it's your first time in the U.S. And he was like a 40 years guy, and like the first time. And said why? And because they asked for a visa for Polish people. And he says, well, also Brazilians, they ask for a visa for Brazilian people. And he said, oh, no, but they asked for a lot of documents for us. And she said, come on, we almost sell our grandmother to go to Disneyland. We sell everything, we don't care. So it's very funny. I don't know whether this will be a legislation which will foster innovation, as I said, or kill it. So, and also I like this comparison just to end my speech. In the UK, in the last century, in the beginning of the last century, there was a regulation that obliged the cars to have a person in front of them with a red banner waving it in order to protect the horses and the other people that were walking in the streets. So we look at this legislation and we laugh at it. So it doesn't work. Or the question is whether you look at our data protection law or maybe even GDPR as a funny legislation or as a legislation like this smoke-free that allowed that prohibited people to smoke in planes and classrooms and stuff like that. I don't know how this data protection will be seen in the future, and that's it. I'd like to thank you for the time. Please, any questions?
Hi, thank you. Actually, it's a question for all of you in the workshop. Given particularly what happens in YouTube, it's very usual, it's very common that when you search for a video regarding, for instance, a defender of the flat earth theory on YouTube, you get by the AI conducted to a lot of other successive videos are about of other different conspirationist theories regarding already established scientific protocols of our democratic tradition. And for instance, anti-vaccination movements and people denying the global warming. I would like to know, in further perspective of regulation, if you think particularly that YouTube should be prohibited of allowing videos that publish blatantly lying content regarding scientific subjects or debates already established in the tradition of the scientific reasoning.
That's a difficult question in a way. Maybe actually some of my colleagues here who presented the content regulation or moderation panel have more to say about this topic about content removal, basically, right? Moderation. But we can think of examples of these algorithms being really problematic. I think Stefan spoke to the problems of algorithm. You can think of, for example, if you're on a YouTube watching, particular, sexist or violent videos, and YouTube is going to, by the logic of relevance, recommend even more violent and sexist videos to you, right? I mean, is that a good idea? Probably not, right? And so I think relevance, we can understand relevance in certain contexts and make it actually making sense to that particular context, right? But this makes probably the algorithm itself hard to produce based on specific content, right? And so perhaps these algorithms can be tweaked in ways to be more content, maybe category specific, right? To make it more making sense to the user who are viewing these. Other content removal moderation policies we've seen is one is you can flag these videos as being problematic. That's one way of doing it. Some of my colleagues actually also recommended systems that use sort of a community model to do that. But how successful it is at the commercial level on scale, it's hard to see. And China has some interesting examples. Actually, 2 years ago, I heard a presentation talking about peer-to-peer content moderation, actually on a Chinese social media platform called Xinglang Weibo, which is the equivalent of Twitter in China. They've been quite successful in moderating a lot of problematic, quote-unquote problematic content. So maybe communities have a role to play. The third, I think, is the sort of first threshold done by a lot of these corporations now. If you ask anybody from Google, YouTube, or Twitter, their first tool for content moderation is actually algorithm, right? And so, and this raises a lot of questions of how good the algorithm is. And I think Stefan, definitely is correct that we need to look at an algorithm. But I think a fundamental problem is, do we really understand the algorithm enough to actually do a good job of auditing and examining, opening the black box, so to speak, looking inside the algorithm, and say something probably is wrong, needs to be tweaked, right? So I think it needs not only sort of industry to be a little bit more transparent, but also the users, although I think have a role to play to flag content that are problematic. And if we have, let's say, a commission looking at all these complaints independently, they can go to, for example, YouTube or Twitter and say something is off, right? Can we look at your algorithm? Can you do something about it, right? Because right now we don't have any algorithm mechanism, unless, like in the case of Tulsi Gilbert, that's sort of outed in the public press, then, Google and YouTube maybe will look at the case individually, but it's not at the systematic level of correction. So that's sort of the answer that I have.
Extremely interesting question. The question behind your question is you want to know if we should regulate social media or not. And from a liberal point of view, this is the wrong idea. That's the wrong direction. From a liberal point of view, we're supposed to regulate the state and the administration, but not private companies or private persons. From a more neutral point of view, we should regulate everyone who's got power. And of course, the YouTube and the algorithm YouTube uses have an immense power, and because they're powerful, they should be regulated. But there are some instruments you shouldn't use in regulating YouTube. There are instruments that belong in the hand of the state, of public authorities, and so that's the idea of sanctioning that should be always in the hand of the state, or the idea of blocking someone or silencing someone, or to remove content. These are questions you can't ask the YouTube or Facebook or Twitter to work in that direction, because they are not prepared for these questions, not at all. They're prepared to give some economic answer to your proposal, but not on the level of a sanction or blocking or silencing someone. So, in my opinion, it's not the right idea to address these kind of regulations to the social media platforms. That's a question the state has to deal with its own means and its own opportunities.
Yeah, I believe this is. I would like. I wanted to wait everybody to speak, because I'm the opinion of to respect the freedom of expression at the most, but you also have in Brazil at least the Brazilian internet law that allows the removal of content, and if we allow the state to regulate this kind of thing, for me, in the long term, it can be, at least in the mid or long term, it can be very dangerous to allow the state to control this sort of information. Of course, I think the worst example for me was that Facebook promoted the genocide in Myanmar. So for me, it was the worst. But how can we react? I think probably that with the community regulation, maybe Facebook improving its algorithms to monitor it, like as Instagram does with adult content. When it's posted, it removes it, recognizes it. Some stuff like that. There is a sentence that is very interesting from an investor in the Silicon Valley that says that the technology companies invested a lot of money to improve their algorithms. Now we want to see if they will invest the same amount of money to make them more transparent, accountable, and ethical.
I'd like to here. I'd like to ask about the use of IA in smart cities, and then I'd like to go a little further in the Brazilian context, because perhaps it's better used in planned cities, and historically here cities were not planned, they were just appearing here and there, and disparity is a rule, so it's not so equal to monitor and things like that. No, I'd like to ask about that. Thank you.
Smart cities, what was your question? I mean, you wanna talk about data protection at smart cities?
No, the use of IA, and to ask if this model of governance is capable to be used in all kinds of city, because here they are very disparate between them.
Yeah.
And perhaps in Europe or US it's easier to be used, but here there are two cities inside of one city, if I can say that.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, first of all, I don't believe at the moment in smart cities working. Like, I would never enter an autonomous car because I'm really worried about cybersecurity issues. So I'll never enter an autonomous car. So the best, it's funny because also talking about the crypto economy, the safest way to protect your bitcoins or your cryptocurrencies is by writing at the paper. So I'd like to be offline at least in some sort of. But I don't work with smart cities. I don't know if you have that still a project in Germany, smart cities project. You have in China something?
Yes, I think China is in the sort of on its role to more and more these kinds of project. In a way, China's surveillance industry has grown a lot, and in the sense that it's not only making the state omnipresent, but also making more economically sound sort of economic opportunities for the industry, right? So I think you can think of how both the state and the industry actually benefits from these kind of initiatives, probably at the cost of user privacy. I mean, from the perspective of users who would raise these points, one of the things I think that is happening in China, and in a way it's quite dystopian, is the exponential growth of surveillance industry. To give you some examples, right now in China, there are about 170,000 million surveillance cameras. And in the next 5, maybe 10 years, the number is supposed to grow to even twice that, right? So you can see how this kind of investment is a boon, almost a gift to the surveillance industry. and also a boon for the state, because right now the Chinese state is very, very much centralized. We have a president who is really interested in building infrastructure, digital infrastructure, to put the entire population under the state gaze of surveillance. So it is a huge problem. I don't know if in a different political, social context, how that could be, shaken out differently. But in the Chinese context, what I see is sort of the rise of an enormous surveillance state and society.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions revolving around that entire Chinese social scoring system. And the first question would be, does it work yet, or is it all more hype as yet? The first thing, and then how is it supposed to work once it's fully operational, and where does the state get its data from? Is there a sort of general API that every company has to connect to the state and make its data public and available to the state? Then the second question is perhaps to Dr. Brink. Which risks do you see that European states, Western states, will move in that direction, not in having a fully fledged system, but in adapting certain elements of that, in scoring data that's available, using that data to, for predictive policing and elements like that? So are we slightly moving in that direction just because it works and it makes perhaps government more efficient, or administration more efficient? And third question connected to that, in the general data protection regulation, there's always that idea of the right to be forgotten. Do you think that will be something that is actually feasible, in the sense that we're used to everybody having a credit score, everybody being existing with his or her data? So once you are forgotten, you might not be able to live as well effectively or as comfortably in society anymore. So what would such a right to be forgotten entail? Which rights what should be forgotten, what not? Can you have a say in the elements that need to be forgotten, or is it just a blank, fresh start? Because I can see that in a data-driven world, it can't just be that all data are forgotten, but how do you regulate or decide which ones are forgotten and which ones are not? Thank you.
By a show of hands, how many of you have heard about the social credit system in China? All right, I need a whole afternoon to explain this. So let me do this quickly, as quickly as I can and efficiently as I can. It is to a large extent, a mechanism of social management in China. It is supposedly a scoring system, trying to score Chinese individuals, companies, organizations, as well as government units on categories and dimensions the government, the state thinks necessary. So a lot of you, knowing something about the social credit system might, have you watched this Black Mirror episode called, what's the episode exactly? You remember the episode exactly? What's that? Yes. Okay. Thank you. It's called Nosedive. Basically, the idea that everybody has a phone, can go around rating everybody else based on their interactions, and the algorithm then will calculate a score for you based on what everybody else is saying about you. So your reputation is decided by collectively by the society, so to speak, and so on and so forth, right? But China is not there. There is no universal score for each and every individual, at least not yet. And there are a lot of experiments at the local level. So I think there are different things going on at the same time. The idea of a social credit system was proposed by the Chinese government in 2014. The State Council issued a plan to develop this system. initially as a financial scoring system, because China for the longest time, really developed in the past 30, 40 years, didn't have a very sound financial scoring system, so to speak. Credit bureaus, for example, in the United States or in Germany, have already established a very elaborate system to score people on their financial soundness. But in China, we don't have that for a long time. So initially, this was like a financial scoring system, right? Makes sense, but at the same time, China is proposing additional dimensions to the financial dimension. Ideas such as, have you paid your fines for violating traffic laws? How often, there's an idea that how often do you, let's say, volunteer in your community, and do you pay visits to your parents, sort of as sort of an indication of filial piety, right? So there are many dimensions that can be tagged along. This is sort of the proposal, grand idea, but currently the system really is at an initial stage. At the national level, there are, for example, in the financial sector, the People's Bank of China is doing a lot of financial scoring. Then at the local level, there are about 30 and 30 plus cities that are experimenting with their local version of social credit system. So these are the systems that actually have different dimensions, including, violations and so on and so forth, that will be considered in the local version. Based on what I read, I'm planning to do more research in this area and do field work. But based on what I've read so far, lots of the cities' systems don't work. To give an example to consider, so in a lot of Chinese economically developed cities, including the one in Hangzhou, where Alibaba is headquartered, there's a social credit system in that city. It's not a small city, millions of people. So at the local level, there are a lot of experiments to see what might work and what might not. But it turns out, when you go and visit the local municipal social credit system building, hardly anybody go there. And a lot of people haven't heard in the city their own local social credit system. And there were not enough incentives to promote the system, not enough incentives for people to sort of buy into the system, right? So it's a good idea. It's not. I'm not saying. I shouldn't say it's a good idea. It's an idea that the local government is playing with, but it's not effective, right? So I think this is one of the things that people think about these sort of grand projects at the sort of abstract level. That is similar to past e-government projects that we have heard about before, right? They sound really good and gets a lot of data and interaction, but in reality, they often fail. So I think it needs to be sort of seen in a couple of years how these systems are developed and over time, basically. So I don't know if that answers your question to some extent. Maybe we can talk about more. But the other piece I would say quickly is that initially, there are 8 companies in China given a license to develop their own version of a social credit system. Last year, actually, the state council sort of took away their license and basically said, whatever system you're coming up with really are biased. We really don't trust the data that you use to score your customers. So that has been, I think, going on for a while. The only system that is running successfully, a commercial system, is called Sesame Credit. In Chinese, it's called 芝麻信用. It's developed by Alibaba, but there's a lot of buy-in. 500 million people now in China are using that credit scoring system because there's enough incentives to actually entice people to use it. For example, my sister, I asked her, interview her as my sort of subject, how you're using it. She actually uses it to, if you have a high score, you can use it to, for example, freely charge your phone to rent a bike, for example, in the city, and to do other things that otherwise giving you conveniences basically in your daily life. So that scoring system by Alibaba is actually working. And people are actually, based on what I could tell, like the system. So the commercial system is working to some extent, but it really depends on how many dimensions they try to include in that system.
Yeah, I agree completely with that point of view. I would say it the other way around. The social scoring system in China works, not yet in China, but it works all over the places. Even in Europe, as a very bad example, what you shouldn't do with personal data. That's one of the great effects of social scoring system, that you have it's kind of promotion of data protection, in my opinion. Yeah, because everyone who's has the idea that data protection is quite an old idea of the 80s of the last century, or isn't really useful, or is an obstacle for progress or anything else. With the China social scoring system, you see what's the opposite idea against in comparison with data protection. It's a radical system. It's a system that tries to spread out into all dimensions. It begins financially, but then it's tries to get the social information of relationship between people, the relation within a family, and it spreads out, and that's the problem with this. It's a really radical construction, and an extremely dangerous project, in my idea. In Western democracies, or especially you asked about Europe, is there the danger that we will adopt this social scoring system also in Europe? And the answer is quite clear: no, surely not. But we won't adopt this system as a whole, because it's unconstitutional, and we got many constitutional rights that would be violated by this scoring system. But if we don't take care, we are losing our freedom inch by inch in adopting some parts of this scoring system. So you really have to be very aware that this is a crucial point in our development, and it's it's just the question you asked before about smart cities. It's no question that the processing of personal data is extremely useful. Yeah, that you can explain many things. It's useful on a scientific basis. It's useful as on an everyday use, but that's not the point. The point is that we have to send clear laws to those processors who will use all the data, all the possible data, and that we have to show them the limits. They should not attack. Next question, the right to be forgotten is one of the key elements of the General Data Protection Regulation, but it's not a very strong right, because it can be overruled by the data processor in explaining that he's got an so-called legitimate interest to work, to go on working with this personal data, so he doesn't he won't have to erase this data. So the right to be forgotten is a nice idea, but not very strong.
Just to complement, difference between the GDPR and the Brazilian General Data Protection Law is that even though you have the exception for consent of legitimate interest, here we have a specific exception for consent, which is protection of the financial system. So it's impossible to be forgotten that under Brazilian laws, from the credit score, for instance, at least.
Sorry, can I add something real quick to the social credit system? I think for quite a while, people who study China and especially the social credit system, they're almost like two debates, right? On the one hand, you have people who, like Stefan says, it's patently bad idea. How would you even start such a credit system? On the other hand, there are other folks who are saying, you know, we really don't have like a consolidated scoring systems, not yet. You know, it's like a local experiments and it's going to fail at the local level. And so, you know, don't worry about it, right? So you have people on the one hand saying, yeah, this is the end of the day. And then the other people say, you know, don't worry about it. I think reality probably will be somewhere in between. What I worry now is actually just about 2 weeks ago, the Chinese State Council now, I think State Council probably proposed an idea, a bill, almost to link online speech to the social credit system. So I think that is the step that worries me a lot, right? You can, for example, current system, if you score low, if you don't pay your, you know, debt, for example, to the banks or so on and so forth, you are forbidden to travel by train or by plane. Okay, I mean, that's fine. But now if your speech, online speech, is tied to the social credit system, that is the problem. Well, one might say, you know, China has already had these censorship rules baked into the legal system, and the laws are in the books anyway. So what's wrong linking one to the other? But that's the trick. If you build a mechanism for people to police themselves, that is, I think, really worrisome to me. Because, you know, for a long time, 5 years now so far, we haven't seen any significant development until this year that actually link the system to speech. And I think that's really worrisome. The second point I want to make quickly is that it's the notion of function creep. One thing that is designed for a specific thing can be sort of growing in directions you don't want. So, for example, in Florida, there has been a proposal from the local police asking for access to people's not only combine, you know, sort of having their access to their criminal data, but also to have like access to their social media data as well. So, I mean, in some ways, this idea of social credit system in its sort of embryonic forms is taking off at other places as well, right? And so I think that is something we need to worry about. And in Japan, there are also similar examples, but also sort of in the financial sense, people who exercise more are giving a lower interest rate when they ask for a loan. So to some extent, some Japanese companies are already implementing their own version of the social credit system, right? And so I think you will see in the next 5 years a lot of experiments in this space, although people are doing it differently. So the laws and regulation and the social norms will actually shape how different systems work out in different societies.
Can I? Yeah. Hi, I'm Marco. It's really nice to be here in the annual meeting of Black Mirror Fans. I work as a political advisor in the Consulate of Japan, trying to explain Brazil to Japanese diplomats. I would like to ask questions to every members of the panel. First, Professor Min Yang, I would like to hear from you in broad words the difference or the similarities between national strategies of AI of South Korea and Japan in comparison to China. How close are they, or how different are they? Yeah. Or if there's nothing to do between these
these three countries. Also, being a Chinese professor living in the United States, I would like to listen from you about how is your relationship, or how is your relationship with Chinese government and with American politicians, because in recent years we've saw a increase of xenophobic speech in the U.S. Some Republicans, politicians, Senator Rubio, even President Trump, saying all Chinese scholars here in the U.S. they are not scholars; they are actually spying on us. How it has affected you, if has affected anyhow. Dr. Stefan Brink, I would like to learn from you about how was the impact of AI in the recent European Parliament elections, either in Europe or more specifically in Germany or in your states. How was the impact of that, or of bots, fake news, if they have spread or not, if they have direct or indirect impact in the final results? Finally, Dr. Daniel Marques, I would like to please hear from you. How is the panorama of law tax in today's Brazilian markets, today's Brazil law markets? I mean, in terms of market share, how's the relationship of law tax firms with the law bar, OAB, who are requesting service for law tax firms? I mean, which kind of company? Big companies, small companies, only startups, individuals as well. Thank you very much.
Not Daniel Marques, I'm Daniel Becker, but I'm replacing him. But okay. Please go ahead.
I really don't have an answer for the first question. I don't know very much about AI development in Japan, but I would rather take up the second question if you don't mind. The current U.S.-China war, trade war, U.S.-China trade war really is shaping up a lot of policies, not only in terms of sort of personal repercussions, Chinese citizens living in the U.S., but also at every front, actually. To give you some examples to think about, we know the two countries are slapping on each other a lot of sanctions, right? That's impacting both U.S. and Chinese economy, to some extent, really individuals as well. That has a lot of consequences for Chinese, for example, exports. China is at least 25 to 30% dependent on exports. So the trade war is not helping with Chinese economic situation. The second point is now Trump is just so unpredictable. You don't know what he's going to do, actually. He just tweets, and it sometimes, I mean, those tweets are important because those are policy indications that are really driving the stock market up and down, right? And this morning I was reading my tweets, and there has been news leaked out of the White House, and they are saying if China moves its military over sort of the border into Hong Kong, U.S. is going to have more sanctions on China, right? So these are really worrisome developments, I think, for China and U.S. The third point I will make is that what's happening to China and U.S. Is similar to what happened between Japan and the U.S. 35 years ago. Back then, Japan was labeled as the currency manipulator. Japan was labeled as the theft of intellectual property. Japan was labeled as a lot of things that the U.S. is blaming China on, right? because Japan at the time was the economic giant from Asia that is supposed to threaten America's lead in economy and technological development. So some argument could be made that what's happening to China now is sort of a recurring chapter of history. We don't know how it's going to shake out because on both sides, I think the leaders are pretty strong and determined to fight it out. The last point I will make is that individuals do feel the sanctions because the U.S. has specific visa quota for foreigners, and including that for Chinese as well. So nowadays, actually, because of these trade wars and because of these sanctions on individuals, at my university at least, we are seeing a very precipitous drop of foreign students from both China and India going to U.S. to study because they don't see a future if they can't get a green card, right? And so a lot of them are actually leaving United States for other countries like Germany and why not, because there are more favorable conditions for them. And in terms of traveling, now I think this is on the table as a policy that Chinese traveling into the United States would have to would be subject to turning over their social media data as well, if they are sort of sampled by the immigration system to examine their social media. So this is like unfolding at so many different levels. Maybe we can talk after the conference as well.
Yeah. Your question was about the impact of artificial intelligence on the recent parliament elections in the European Union and the level of the member states. And the answer is we don't know yet about that. There's scientific research on the run, ongoing scientific research, but I don't know yet the results. What we see is that the right-winged parties seem to understand better the logic of social media, and what we see is a swing in the elections to right-wing parties on the European level. That has something to do with the functioning of digital communication, I think. I think the right-wing parties make a clever use of the aspects of digital communication. It's a fast communication. It's an extremely open communication. It's most of the time emotional, sometimes irrational, and these are things that seem to match better with the right-wing parties. Fast communication looks not at the better argument, it looks at the quicker argument. Emotional argumentation looks to the louder argument and not to the complicated one. And sometimes we got a problem with the complexity of our actual world. And on the European level, the right-wing parties have simple answers to all questions. And that might be better for them to use or to understand this logic of social media communication.
Thank you for your question. Actually,
I have one last question.
no, I'm
Yeah.
still answering his question.
Oh, sorry? No,
Yeah.
I didn't.
Actually, there are 200 law texts right now in Brazil, and I can see like the trends are online dispute resolution, automation of documents, and legal analytics, jurymetrics, and I think these are the three huge trends that in the short term you represent like the maybe not the end but the decrease of the mass litigation. I don't know, contencioso de massa. At some level, the decrease of law clerks as well and junior lawyers, and I think contract drafting as well. Contract drafting has been huge disrupted by legal technology. But the very good question that you asked is the position of our Brazilian Bar Association. The Brazilian Bar Association right now, he tried 3 years ago. He tried to shut down some law techs, but now even filing lawsuits, class actions against these law techs. But now it accepted it, and it is focusing on what we call the civic tax. I don't know if you heard of it, but it's like you can. There are companies that buy your consumer claim and file a notice and then a lawsuit against a flight company or a telecom company, and they're including ongoing lawsuits against these because they are marketing. You know that marketing is prohibited by the Statute of Ethics of the Brazilian Bar Association, as well as some of these companies, they show the prices that they charge and stuff like that. So I think this is the target right now that the Brazilian Bar Association is focusing. It accepted the law tax as a sort of because the whole discussion is about UPL, unauthorized practice of law. So if you are allowing a machine or maybe someone who is not a lawyer to practice some act that is private to a lawyer, only a lawyer can practice it. That's a big issue. But the problem is that law techs are automating tasks that are not private. That you don't need a license to practice them. So I think this is the big issue we're on.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm so sorry. Talking about democracy, I want to know if in Brazil or in the world there are examples that AI help citizens to vote or to know more about its representatives. I'm asking that because I met Bússola Eleitoral, electoral compass that act in legislative power and use machine learning to compile and viabilize to citizens to know more about the parliament and its representatives, and I didn't met any other example in the world.
My answer will be really short. In China, we don't have elections.
Well, there's a very good example here in Rio de Janeiro state. The general public prosecutor started an initiative called how do you say that? Public Prosecutor Office on Maps, MP Mapas, and this collecting huge amount of data. And for me, the best example how it helps with control and democracy is that now they are crossing the donation to political parties with the bills that are being presented in the state congress. So it's very interesting, so that you can connect it, so then they can file a lawsuit, try to implicate something, and it's very interesting. Now they are discussing how they are going to open it to the public. I will have a meeting with them later in this month to discuss it, but it's very interesting, and you should look for it.
Yeah, I'd say we don't have the right ideas yet how artificial intelligence might support democracy, but we have to learn fast and have to develop these tools. There must be some tools hidden down there, but we didn't yet find them. There's one thing that supports democracy, that's not artificial intelligence, that's freedom of information. That supports democracy. When we, if we might find some tools supporting freedom of information, even on the basis of artificial intelligence, we might support democracy itself.
I think this was the last question. I would like to thank everyone. Thank you for the panelists.
Sorry, I had one more.
No, no problem.
It was a question for Dr. Brink, actually. My name is Anya. I wanted to know, I wanted you to speak a little bit more, actually, to the 2 slides that you skipped on data minimization and purpose limitation. Also, in light of the argument Dr. Jiang also made that, I mean, even in India where I work, it's often argued that actually the GDPR is having economic consequences that are quite dangerous. And when it comes to the development of AI, then the argument is that purpose limitation and data minimization will actually make it much harder to develop new algorithms, also because a lot is developed by just trying things, right? And experimenting, which becomes much harder if you have to say beforehand what you're collecting the data for. And you yourself very briefly mentioned that question of training data as well. So I was wondering, can you speak a little bit more to how you see that entire debate, what the challenges are, whether the economic consequences really are so dire as some say, etc. Thank you.
Well, I can tell you something about these problems. If I'm speaking on these 2 issues, it'll take 2 or 3 hours. Yeah, the problem is that the general data protection regulation has on the first view, some negative effects on these points you pointed out. It's the question that that the purposes are extremely reduced. It's the problem that you can't gather enough training data for artificial intelligence. If you are under the strong threat of data protection. We found several ways to deal with it on the European basis. For example, the whole question of research and scientific work with artificial intelligence and with training data is accepted. It's excluded from the data from the GDPR. So we don't have this conflict any longer, but that's only research on the research level. When you develop as an enterprise these questions and try to process this training data, you have really strong problems with the GDPR, and we haven't solved them yet. That's why I skipped those 2 points, because it's always a problem if you can point out the problematic issue, but you don't have the solutions yet. Yeah.
So now, finally, thank you everybody. Thank you the panelists for the presentations. That's it.